This video is sponsored by Mubi. Also, I have a podcast called Rehash. I co-host it with my best friend Hannah, and it's all about recent social media phenomenons that get us all up in arms, only to forget about them within a week. So we rehash them, as they say. We're on our third season now, which looks at paradigm shifts on the internet, moments that changed the way we do things, for better or for worse. We cover everything from By Sister to Deb v. Heard to the end of Vine. Go check it out. Earlier this year, A.O. Scott, the chief film critic of the New York Times, announced that he would be leaving the job, and in doing so, expressed great concern for the state of his art form.
I haven't lost faith in movies. I still love movies. I will still go to movies. But I do, I do worry still, and going forward, and I worry about my fellow critics, and I worry about the state of the art form that we all care so much about.
A few months later, The Guardian published a scathing article by Manuela Lazic called "Who Needs Film Critics When Studios Can Be Sure That Influencers Will Praise Their Films?" In this article, Lazic derided the new influencer marketing models of the Hollywood majors, which she argues have essentially pushed critics out of their positions. When another article came around bashing movie talk creators within a day's time, causing a whole slur of people in the movie talk community to clap back, it became clear that something fishy is going on. Needless to say, there's quite a bit of discord in the film criticism community right now. A verifiable battle between film critic and film influencer, establishment and fringe, old and new. And it sounds like the old is losing. At this point in time, film criticism is as old as film itself. Film critics are so a part of cinema as we know it that it's almost impossible to imagine an industry without them. So this recent grave digging has more than a few people worried, to say the least. But hatred for the film critic is also as old as film itself, so others have been pretty glad to hear the bell toll. Whatever side you stand on, though, one has to wonder what the culprit is. Is it the slow death of journalism that's killing the film critic? Or is it the critic's fault that they got too big for their britches and started demanding too much from distributors? Maybe it's the democratization of the internet, or those pesky, money-grubbing influencers. Whatever it may be, people have been ringing the death knell on film criticism for forever. So, is it really ending? I think many, A.O. Scott included, would say yes. But how can we be sure? To understand where we're at right now, we need an understanding of, and maybe even an appreciation for, the role of film criticism in the film industry and pop culture more broadly. Has whatever it is actually killed the film critic? There are two general types of film criticism. There's film scholarship, which is usually printed in journals like Sight and Sound, or Film Comment, or Cahiers du Cinéma. Think your Andre Bazins and Peter Wallins and Laura Mulvey's. Then there's film journalism, which is the kind I think most people are familiar with. These are the review-style articles that tend to appear in news publications. And it's this kind of film criticism, the kind done by the likes of A.O. Scott, that's at risk of dying out. As far back as the early 1900s, people were printing commentaries about film. Journals like the Optical Lantern and Cinematograph Journal and Bioscope were offering the occasional reflection or review on different silent movies that were coming out. By the 20s, newspapers caught wind of this growing trend and started to hire people who had enough of a knowledge and interest in film to write about it for a living. And thus, the film critic was born. But the pioneering critics were pretty far off from the critics as we know them today. I've brought in YouTube's resident specialist on old Hollywood, my friend Be Kind Rewind, to give us some of her expertise on this particular subject. Take it away, Izzy.
The first publication widely credited with birthing film criticism as a practice was, as Ms. Deschanel mentioned, the Optical Lantern and Cinematograph Journal, which began circulation in 1904. Largely a trade publication, the Optical Lantern really covered it all when it came to the very new industry of filmed entertainment. Chats with trade leaders, helpful hints about projection, news about technological advances, but most importantly for us, it included a section on new films, which asked two fundamental questions. What's going to be available to see, And is it worth your time? These reviews speak to a broadly held view in the first half of the 20th century that film was entertainment or a craft, but not so much an art form, certainly not as important or as serious as traditional theater or novels. That said, the interest in film as both entertainment and an industry developed rapidly, and journalism covering it did as well, though at first not exactly in the form of criticism as we know it today. Through the 1950s, most of what Americans consumed regarding movies came in the form of publicity straight from the studio, nationally syndicated gossip columns from the likes of Hedda Hopper and Llewellyn Parsons, fan magazines like Photoplay and Silver Screen, and the occasional profile or feature article from journalists like Bob Thomas. Outlets like Variety and The Hollywood Reporter also existed, but those were considered trade publications for people who wanted an economic or business perspective on the industry. Most local papers didn't have dedicated film critics, and more often than not would just ask their drama critic to step in and review a film if necessary. But they wouldn't mind pulling in a sports or a politics reporter to fill in and give their take either. Some larger papers, however, dedicated specific desks to their film critics, especially the New York Times, where a succession of critics like Mordaunt Hall, Frank Nugent, Bosley Crowther, and Vincent Canby deepened a sense of a film culture in the United States. And let's not forget our female film critics either. According to Jerry Roberts in The Complete History of American Film Criticism, the nation's widest read daily newspaper in the post-World War II era was the New York Daily News, where Dorothy Masters, Wanda Hale, and Kate Cameron wrote reviews. Although Kate Cameron was actually a nom de plume for a series of different female critics who all wrote under the same name, weirdly. Black writers, however, were largely excluded from major papers and instead wrote for exclusively Black publications like the Chicago Defender and the California Eagle. As the art form and industry continued to develop, it became undeniable that criticism would have to play a larger role moving forward. First, film had obviously proven to be something worth dissecting, not frivolous entertainment. Films like I Am a Fugitive of a Chain Gang clearly demonstrated film's power in commenting on, critiquing, and illustrating American life, while films like Carl Theodor Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc and Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin showed narrative and artistic inventiveness that was completely unique from the stage and required its own critical language. Second, critics became a necessary counterbalance to the influence of the major studios. Imagine, if you will, a world in which studios could simply say whatever they wanted about their films without pushback, in which everything was an ad, each insisting that actually the film is great and please give us money for it, thank you. At a certain point, it becomes beneficial for the audience for a third party to give an outsider's perspective, so critics began acting as a check of sorts in multiple ways. For example, the New York Film Critics Circle formed in response to the studio's influence over the Academy Awards, creating a new context for awards in which none of the voters had a financial stake in the outcomes. So to sum it all up, some writers in the early 20th century were working hard to foster a film culture in the US, and to develop a new language that could accurately describe the young art form rather than simply borrowing words and ideas from theatrical criticism. But that wasn't quite the norm, nor were those writers entirely accessible to most filmgoers. As Roberts writes, the general opinion of film critics up until the 1960s was that they were, by and large, composers of plot précis with an opinion tacked on, and with all the depth of a loved her, hated him quip. In the 1960s, that began to change.
So, as the post-war era rolled around and European influence seeped into Hollywood, things began to change. There were a number of film scholars from the Nouvelle Vague or New Wave movement like Truffaut and Godard and Antonioni making films that bent and sometimes even broke the conventions of cinema and stretched moral boundaries far beyond what Hollywood cinema code would allow. And this came as a great challenge for the establishment critics, who weren't exactly sure what to do with a film that they actually kind of liked, but that broke all the rules that they more or less helped to entrench. As Jeffrey Noel Smith puts it in Film Quarterly, a realization was dawning that more mainstream films, westerns for example, or domestic dramas, had more going on for them than received opinion allowed for. What was evident in this situation was a need for criticism to help illuminate these films, both the rule-defying ones and the ones that played by the rules, but also a debate about what sort of animal this criticism should be. In comes the critic star, a figure of American cinephilia in its truest form. As our naughty Europeans peacocked to what was then a pretty repressed Hollywood in the 50s and 60s, a new, eager generation of American filmmakers took note, and with the economic liberties of this period, were able to make deeply inspired, provocative, and groundbreaking films of their own. And with them came a wave of film critics writing for major magazines and outlets who served more or less as the Mickey Goldmill to the filmmakers Rocky Balboa, and became household names for it. It's pretty likely you might be familiar with at least one of these names. Pauline Kael of The New Yorker, Andrew Sarris of The Village Voice, Molly Haskell of The Village Voice, Vincent Canby of The New York Times, James Agee of Time Magazine, Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times, or Manny Farber of, everything. The reviews these people were writing were longer, more analytical, and more influential than the critics who came before them. These critics had an extensive knowledge of not only the formal language of filmmaking, but of film history itself. Peter Bogdanovich, for example, wrote monographs in the 60s that almost single-handedly reinvigorated audience interests in directors like Alfred Hitchcock and Orson Welles, contributing to the persistence of their legacies today. And these critics were also championing films that the old fuddy-duddy establishment, and sometimes American audiences themselves, would typically have hated. This was a time when a review could effectively make or break a film. Pauline Kael basically became famous for this. In 1967, she was only working as a freelancer for The New Yorker when she wrote her lengthy review of Bonnie and Clyde, a movie that was getting absolutely obliterated by critics for its extreme violence. Kael defended the film on the basis that Hollywood's best movies have always made entertainment out of the anti-heroism of American life. Her review landed her a full-time position with the magazine and is widely cited as the instigator for bringing Bonnie and Clyde to mainstream attention, thus kicking off the Hollywood New Wave. Later, in her exuberant review of Bertolucci's Last Tango in Paris, the now disgraced, but then a rather explicit and groundbreaking film for American sensibilities, she predicted, "This must be the most powerfully erotic movie ever made, and it may turn out to be the most liberating movie ever made." This review again went on to be one of the most famous reviews in movie history and helped put Last Tango on the map as one of the highest-grossing films of 1973, despite its many censorship controversies. When Universal executives first watched George Lucas's American Graffiti, they were at a loss, worried that audiences wouldn't take to what was then a pretty experimental film. But then the critics loved it. In his glowing review, Stephen Farber, critic for The Hollywood Reporter, not to be confused with Manny Farber, paints a carefully crafted picture for what the audience can expect, and then goes on to say, "Part of the experience of moviegoing is private dreaming in the dark, but the best movies create a fragile community of dreamers. This is why movie houses are still, on occasion, the true churches of the 20th century. American Graffiti connects with an audience in a way that few movies ever have." The studios ended up putting all the money they could into promoting the movie, bringing it a ton of success, which Farber later partially attributed to the words of critics like himself. And this trend of reviews that contrasted and shaped public and studio opinions would follow for the next few decades. For example, Roger Ebert's dogged praise for Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. When the movie first came out, the press expressed fears that it would incite violence and stoke racial tensions in the US, which Ebert, in his review, argues says more about the critics than the movie. In response to early indictments that the film was confused, he said, "Anyone who walks into this film expecting answers is a dreamer or a fool, but anyone who leaves the movie with more intolerance than they walked in with wasn't paying attention." And it's this ambiguity and complexity that many of these major New Wave critics were rooting for. When Do the Right Thing lost at Cannes, Ebert was so indignant that he threatened to never go back to the festival again, a gesture that earned him a special place in Lee's heart. Actually, Ebert has many reviews that were extremely ahead of their time, standing behind films that wouldn't be redeemed in the public eye until even decades later. For a long time, critics sang for the unsung. They were bastions of capital F film, And Farber argues that this generation of critics may have inspired the one that followed to become filmmakers themselves, citing Peter Bogdanovich as an example of an American critic who did the Truffaut thing and went on to make a whole host of acclaimed movies of his own, which Farber says is largely owed to Andrew Sarris, the critic who invented auteur theory, which explained and drove a lot of the director-led movies of New Hollywood and beyond. In fact, Martin Scorsese, who was once roomies with Sarris, said, "What Andrew did, especially for young people, was to make you aware that the American cinema, which you had been told was just a movie factory, had real artistic merit." So, from this view, how could anyone ever hate film critics? I was chatting with someone at a film festival recently, and we did the usual, "What do you do? What do you do?" thing. And when I told him I make videos about film, he was like, "You're the analysis kind, right? Not the critic kind. I feel like critics are so overly negative." And one of the movie talkers in the Times article echoed that very sentiment, saying, "Critics watch movies and are just looking for something to critique." So true. Isn't it so annoying when you call a plumber and all they want to do is fix a leak in your sink? So the critic is a pretty reviled figure, both outside the film world and within it. I mean, their movie counterparts are pretty awful, right? Like Waldo Lydecker and Laura, or Addison DeWitt in All About Eve, both of whom are unlikable downers. The question often waged against critics is, who are you to be picking apart this movie? With the sentiment stemming from the fact that critics are people with an unearned authority to essentially tear something down that others might enjoy. And to be fair, critics have been on the other side of public opinion before. Like, Kael called The Sound of Music the single most repressive influence on artistic freedom in movies, yet that movie went on to become the highest grossing movie of all time for a bit. Critics despised The Exorcist when it came out, but it was an immediate sensation around the country. Many people to this day also argue that critics tend to only favor boring art house movies and hate anything with commercial appeal. There are exceptions, of course, but this blockbuster bashing may be a product of the New Hollywood critics. I mean, Stephen Farber said it himself. A good critic wants to encourage people to support worthwhile and innovative films rather than the simple-minded, well-publicized trash that is always at a premium. So they haven't exactly helped themselves here. There's also, admittedly, a lot of true blue gatekeeping going on with film criticism, especially with legacy publications. There are paywalls, which may block out younger people from accessing reviews. Sometimes the language can be a bit lofty, which, don't get me wrong, a lot of the time I enjoy, but I can see how it's sometimes alienating. And historically, only certain kinds of people were let into the club. I spoke to Toronto-based critic, academic, and film programmer Saffron Maeve to get her perspective on what's going on right now, and what it's like to be a young critic working today. This is what she had to say.
There's an inherent elitism to criticism. There's an inherent intellectualism, and it can be very intense. Like, I've experienced it very much. I'm very often the only woman and the only woman of color in my little cohorts of places where I've written. And that can be very isolating and it can be very intimidating.
Another bone that people like to pick with critics is that their reviews lack objectivity. Often they're accused of being too narrow-minded, only factoring their own opinions in rather than looking at the work from the objective, median stance of the masses. Surely, and aggregators like Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic have blown this wide open, if the disparity between audiences and critics is so great, then maybe the critics are simply biased, maybe even wrong, right? Then there's the concept of ulterior motives, whether that's through bribery or what Farber back in the day attributed to a growing, perhaps undue stardom placed upon critics during the New Hollywood era. Farber, in a 1976 essay called The Power of Movie Critics, uses Pauline Kael as an example of this. According to him, after Kael's last Tango review, she became a superstar in the film community, and so ushered in a wave of copycats clamoring to give sweeping praise to just about every movie that came out around the time. Praise, in Farber's opinion, usually reserved for the Sistine Chapel or King Lear. He thinks Kael herself was also a bit seduced by the limelight. He tracks that her reviews became more and more evangelical in their acclaim over time, relying more on hyperbole than cool, measured analysis. Kael also started to provide distributors with buzzy one-liners about their films, like Going Places and Harry and Tonto, that they could use in the marketing before she had ever even reviewed them. Her name on a movie poster or a marquee was the price of gold. Farber further argues that the rise in flashier television critics like Siskel and Ebert and the competition they posed increased the desire for name recognition amongst critics. So you can see how people may be turned off or at least dubious of the critic's review when there were greater powers at hand coercing them into something maybe less than objective. So whether it's theatrical praise from a reviewer trying to get their name out there, or the shrewd coolness of someone who refuses to indulge mass culture, the film critic seems to rub people the wrong way in all scenarios. It's a bit of a catch-22. As Nick James writes for Sight and Sound, criticism's fundamental weakness is arguably the dichotomy between the claim of special expertise, an outside perspective, and the wish to speak as a legitimizing part of the community. Like I said before, when Siskel and Ebert came out with their TV show in 1975, this had the trad critics all up in a tizzy. Siskel and Ebert more or less popularized the thumbs up, thumbs down model of reviews, as well as their own distinct top 10 lists, both of which are very attention-grabbing styles of criticism. And because of this, people saw them as populist critics, tending towards the masses and having an overall low-culture taste in movies. Of course, we know today that Siskel and Ebert were both capable of doing the very thing that the Kaels and the Sarases did, which was championing those more experimental films. And, very importantly, they were honest, regardless of whether the public would agree with them. So really, with each new advancement in technology does come a wave of backlash and then a period of adapting until that new technology becomes a dominating force. I mean, back in 1935, Rudolf Arnheim said that film was dead because of the advent of sound, and how wrong was he? So, decades after the move to TV came the move to internet, which again caused rifts in the film criticism community. And this time, it would actually have some real, founded consequences. What hasn't the internet changed about our culture? Okay, for one, there's this whole journalism thing. For a couple decades now, the internet has been hacking off print journalism limb from limb. And so when all these news publications had to pivot online and started losing revenue, the workers paid the price. Like other journalists, film critics are having to push for clicks in the attention economy, all the while getting paid less than they used to. This has led to, as Saffron sees it, a collapsing between film criticism with entertainment journalism, which she says is a problem.
Film criticism and entertainment journalism are two widely different spheres that have now just started being conflated into one thing. And it's beneficial, I think, for the entertainment journalist in a way that it's not beneficial for the film critic at all. Entertainment journalism, to me, more often than not, functions as it has promotional value. So it's almost like news, where you're kind of just relaying that something has come out and this is the synopsis, versus being here are my inner feelings on it. Here's what I think it all might mean. Here's where I would place it within a director's filmography. I think that is increasingly lost with entertainment journalism. I'm a pretty vociferous note taker, so really anything that comes to mind, it tends to be references from other films and other filmmakers, or certain words might jump out. But for me, it's more about working backward from the image and then into the narrative, instead of kind of approaching narratively what's in front of me. And then trying to later figure out how stuff like cinematography might fold into it, which I think I used to have a really bad habit of doing when I was just getting into criticism. And I think that, not to be harping on entertainment journalists, but entertainment journalism doesn't really talk about film as a form or about images or what's actually happening in front of them.
But while journalism is struggling greatly, a lot of people argue that the internet has also led to democratization, which is a good thing. The web has democratized just about everything, and that means film criticism too. As the internet expanded, amateur film reviewers and bloggers began popping up all over the place. My ancestors, if you will. And the ancestors of, you guessed it, movie talk. Democratization can be a good thing. But it also means no barriers to entry, no previous experience required, and no real standard of integrity to adhere to. Unlike the Kaels or the Eberts, reviewers on the internet don't have to have a background in writing. They don't have to have a background in journalism, film, or anything at all. Remember the angry white guy era of film commentary? I wouldn't exactly call that as analytical or illuminating as a Haskell review per se. But I'd be a fool to say that YouTube, which is a platform for longer form videos, hasn't given way to a whole host of amateur film critics, myself included, who, not to toot our horns, I think do indulge more in the analysis side of things. But again, many of us have no accreditation to be able to stamp an authoritative or journalistic label on our work in order for people to take us seriously. Half the time I can't even be open and honest on here because of this insipid platform's ridiculous censorship policies. And then there's Movie Talk. It seems like a majority of the Movie Talk people interviewed for that Times article had never actually read a film review. One guy actually said that critic reviews sound like a computer wrote them, which, huh? Many of these creators receive the occasional sponsorship from studios to promote certain films. So if many critics online are also, by virtue of their platforms, influencers, what happens to a review if the creator has to keep studio interests in mind? Of course, critics do and always have received PR materials or invites to industry parties, which is another common criticism of them. But given the larger prevalence of negative or mixed reviews coming from trad critics, it's clear that these are not the same thing. Few of those movie talkers, with some obvious exceptions, present in-depth or analytical reviews. Many of their reviews tend to be more general in nature, which is partially a product of TikTok's short-form algorithm that limits creators from being able to go in-depth. Richard Brody's appearances on the New York Times TikTok seem to get quite a lot of traffic, but unlike his long-form written reviews, these videos are short-form roundups of his favorite movies of the year, echoing that popular Ebert appeal. Like entertainment journalism, everything has to be buzzier and shorter than ever before.
I think it's just a pretty precarious time to be a critic. It feels like nobody's reading criticism anymore. And there's this inherent meanness to being a critic, or a trad critic, like he said, which Gen Z really seems to push back at. And I have a particular disdain for movie talk. I try my best to engage with it and to understand it, but I can't get with it. The culture of movie talk kind of just feels like a bad omen. It's the way that young people especially, because it tends to be dominated by teenagers, are talking about or discovering film. It just seems to be filtered through not criticism, but these 7-second snarky snippets or vague narrative analyses. We want everything to be super digestible super quickly. We want it to be more audiovisual than we want it to be written, it seems. I also just think teenagers nowadays are taught that their hobbies need to be monopolized upon. So you'll have someone who maybe 20, 30 years ago would just be passionate about watching films, and now they're trying to carve out this career in TikTok journalism, which is really, I think, ultimately serving as promotion for film conglomerates and billionaire execs.
Another problem is one of the major reasons A.O. Scott left his post. Back in 2012, when Scott wrote a negative review of Avengers, Samuel L. Jackson got on Twitter and said, "Avengers fans, New York Times critic A.O. Scott needs a new job. Let's help him find one he can actually do." In the pre-internet age, it's unlikely Jackson could incite a very large crowd against Scott, and even if he did, the worst that would happen would be Scott receiving a few rudely worded letters in the mail. But with the internet, Jackson rallied a whole horde against Scott, who attacked him online. And if you've never been on the receiving end of hate from hundreds or thousands of people, it sucks. This spurred Scott 11 years later to cite online fandoms as a detriment to art. He said, "Fan culture is rooted in conformity, obedience, group identity, and mob behavior, and its rise mirrors and models the spread of intolerant, authoritarian, aggressive tendencies in our politics and our communal life." Harshness of his statement aside, I think what Scott is speaking to is a product of the greater box office crisis happening right now. That's creating mega fandoms for the IP movies that studios are submitting as their best, most assured output for theatrical release. Remember that whole Scorsese quote, "The art of cinema is being systematically devalued, sidelined, demeaned, and reduced to its lowest common denominator, content?" This is more or less in line with what Scott is saying. Fan culture doesn't demand art from movies. It demands content and quantity, which then nullifies the role of the critic, whose job it is to prop up film as an art form. Here's what Scott says in his daily interview.
These movies, I think, are designed to be critic-proof. you create something so enormous and so powerful that seems like just a fact of nature almost, that it just sort of crushes any dissenting voice or point of view and doesn't give you a lot to talk about. I mean, I guess I come back to that. If what criticism is having an argument with or about a movie, the attempt to create argument-proof movies that no one will argue about, that no one will argue with, I think that's very troubling to me.
And Scott isn't the only critic clashing with audiences.
I've gotten so much pushback. Weirdly, the most, I think, was I wrote a blog post, like a self-published, nothing special, didn't think it would circulate. I never write blog posts. I think I've written 2 in my entire life. And it was about my disdain for Pablo Larraín's Spencer. And I put it up just thinking like my friends and followers would see it. And I went and I took an exam and I came out of the exam and it was hellish. I was just being cussed out and I was getting death threats. People were like trying to dox me. Critics have always been considered pricks, but I think that the association of like the film critic in social media and the internet, like you're just kind of asking to get tomatoes thrown at you if you disagree with something. Like it's just too easy to not. I think people nowadays also just don't know how to disagree with something. Like they don't know how to be like, oh, I don't agree with that fact. I feel differently. It has to be like, no, either we agree or I'm going to dox you because you didn't like Spencer. Like that is kind of what it feels like a little bit.
There's simply too much proximity between critic and star and critic and audience, and that isn't a good thing, because what if critics become scared of writing an honest, negative review for fear of getting hate online? The movie talkers in that Times article portray critics as haters, if you will. But when you think about it, if most critics are barely making ends meet today, isn't that more a testament to their love for film than anything else? It takes a lot of work to write a long, thought-out review for just a fraction of what some of those movie talkers are making for a very short video. But as Lazic points out, if critics themselves perceive their work as worthless and pointless and fall into marketing strategies to draw people towards films they love, what place does film criticism hold in today's culture? Even James was writing about this back in 2009 when he said, "The recent US cull of print film reviewers proves that their market value has declined." If the new Hollywood critics suffered from having too much power, then today's critics are suffering from too little. And so, with all that considered, this is how we arrive at the moment where influencers flocked into press screenings of Barbie, adorned in their PR gear and ready to hit the thumbs up button, as the critics watched open-mouthed. And writing her gobsmacked polemic for The Guardian, Lazic asks, where will engaging, challenging, and if not completely unbiased, then at least impartial conversation about cinema take place? And how is the audience going to think critically of what is being sold to it? Does Lazic have a point? If people hate the critic and are cheering for their demise, one has to ask, what's really at stake here? Well, how are we supposed to know the stakes when it seems that no one really knows what a film critic is? First off, what's the point of a film review?
I think a good film review is like holistic. So you're getting like synopsis and background and then like directorial temperament and analysis. And I think if you're honing in on one particular element and ignoring others in the process, which a lot of film reviews seem to be doing as of late, you're really like mistreating the object. To me, like any job, film criticism is valuable in that it can give you context. Like if I go to a doctor, and Christ, I'm not comparing film criticism to medicine, but if I go to a doctor, it's because they have specialized knowledge about a particular subject that I don't. Or if I go to a restaurant, like the waiter is giving me context about the menu and the chef has like the gastronomic context of preparing food. So similarly, a film critic can help you see things that you might have missed or patterns in someone's filmography or references. And I think that when you understand it more, it's just like someone giving you a little bit more context and not someone being apprehensive towards your taste or your opinions, you might find film criticism more digestible.
And with that in mind, I think a lot of the charges against the film critic, they're boring, they're overly negative, they're not objective, are pretty disputable. The no objectivity thing in particular really gets me. Scholar Ian Jarvie wrote back in the 60s that the critic is a person with a whole history that's influenced the way they see the world. For them to be truly objective is impossible. But he says critics can try their best to strive towards objectivity. And the way to do this is through critical discussions and analysis, by sifting through the annals of history and arriving at a conclusion about a work. What does that shot mean, and how does it inform the message of the movie? Does it do it effectively? If I dislike this film for a specific reason, does it share similarities with other films I dislike? And does that speak to a larger trend in filmmaking that I dislike, but which I can back up? Jarvie says, film critics would do well to remember that a film is to its director far more like what a building is to its architect than what an action painting is to an artist. How the good film, like the good building, manages to retain a certain mystery and aesthetic value despite all this can only be discovered if we pool our analyses and ideas in discussion. But to have that discussion, there needs to be discussion, varying opinions, perspectives, disagreements. And that brings us to the other side of the hatred. Film critics are too negative. I personally feel about reviews the same way I feel about movies. Just like how I would rather a film fail spectacularly than be safe.
You want the thrill of your life?
God, TJ, no!
Stumped? I know I am.
I would rather a review be vehemently, shockingly negative, or enthusiastically positive about a spectacularly bad film, than be appeasing to general tastes. Back in 2001, A.O. Scott gave Freddy Got Fingered a hilariously positive review, despite the fact that audiences and just about every other critic hated it. And remarkably enough, he kept his job. Scott spoke about this when he left. He said, "A big part of any critic's job is to be wrong, but to make an early call that is subject to correction by time, taste, and public whim. But it's also the critic's duty to give an honest account of what they think in the moment. People should be able to read a review and disagree with it without throwing it out as some personal affront to themselves or the film." And what I love about a good critic is not just honesty, but passion as well. I love and have always loved reading critic reviews. I disagree with Richard Brody like 80% of the time, but I love that guy because I love the way he writes, and I love hearing an opinion and reading of a film so drastically different from mine. And this is something James also feels. Recalling the great music writers of the 70s, he says, "Alongside their myth-building reverence for the music that moved them, they were always prepared to lash out, to write what is known as knocking copy. Their savagery was just as thrilling to the teenage boy I was as their reverence rhetoric towards their gods." I think that was the appeal of Pauline Kael too. Sure, her reviews became theatrical in their prose, but isn't that kind of exciting as a reader? I want to feel from a critic's review their love and reverence and excitement for filmmaking. I want to hear their joy when films succeed and despair when they fail. Because I think supporting informed, independent, and passionate criticism is to encourage, as James puts it, the tearing down of all things too ordinary in order to put better, more stimulating things in their place. Elegies always come around during times of economic uncertainty. You can find tons of articles declaring the death of film criticism during the 2008 recession, and you can find them now as we stand amidst yet another recession. These moments have a palpable impact on our culture, and this is a prime example. I'm not going to sit here and argue that things need to remain the same forever, but it does make me sad that Scott left his job. However, I think that there are many ways that trad film critics can try and adapt to the times. Maybe opening the doors for younger voices to write for legacy publications in order to balance out the opinions that are coming from them. And there are already quite a few film publications doing that.
I will absolutely shout out CinemaScope, Screen Slate, Movie Notebook, and Reverse Shot.
Letterboxd is a platform that hosts a number of voices, fringe and establishment, writing a wide range of reviews. I personally follow people like David Chen and Demi Adijuibe, both of whom are my go-to if I've just finished a film and I want to expand my perspective on it. David Ehrlich, another extremely successful trad film critic, also posts a lot of his reviews on there for people to read. Again, I think YouTube has become an incredible place to nurture cinephilia, and a starting place for a lot of people just getting into film. Movie Talk also has quite a few creators who are using the medium in inspiring and thought-provoking ways. Trad film critics are also moving to new, long-form platforms like Substack and generating income from there. There are obviously obstacles to some of these solutions, like publications don't have enough money to pay critics, and there's also value that comes with age and longer lived experience, and Substack won't save critics from getting steamrolled online. But regardless, the tides are shifting, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. What is truly at risk of going extinct, to me at least, is the passion. I think the reason Siskel and Ebert were never the threat to film criticism that the internet has been is that Siskel and Ebert were not only palpably passionate about the craft, but also able to express their passion in incredibly engaging and authentic ways. Ways that weren't trying to hop on a trend or treat a film like a commodity rather than an art object. And I think more and more, those are the things we're seeing online.
I don't think criticism is like relegated to the page where you have to like be writing to be a critic. But I think the scary part is like print is dying, and criticism by extension is something that emerged in print also feels like it's dying. It's changing, but the essence of it does feel like it's dying. Yeah, like criticism as a practice is going to adapt. Like it's going to become video essays, very good video essays, and podcasts, and I mean, people will argue TikToks, and I don't know, I like have qualms with that, but I also know that these model ways of consuming film theory and film history, so that's something. But I do also think if film criticism goes entirely audiovisual, where it feels like it's going right now, we're going to lose the poetics and the language that make criticism engaging, or that makes criticism engaging, and that's shaped how we perceive media, or like what we consider to be art.
The internet has become a hostile place for dissenting voices about film. It's also becoming increasingly commercial thanks to studio marketing influences. And democratization is good so long as it doesn't slip into anti-intellectualism. But there's also a lot of hope on here. If we can find a way to foster the passion, then the internet could be a wonderful new home for film criticism. But we have to remember that passion doesn't always mean saying nice things. Cookie Mueller has this amazing quote in this essay about art where she says, "Grouchhood is great. Being a malcontent, lodging complaints right and left can make you a better person. You have to have opinions while looking for art or searching out the other forms of divinity in daily life. In passion, we find divinity. Let's keep the passion alive." One of the bastions of quality, innovative criticism, as mentioned by Saffron, is Notebook, who I'm delighted to say is the sponsor of this video. Notebook is a print-only magazine devoted to the art and the culture of cinema, created, prepared, and published by Mubi. It's published biannually with a yearly subscription that includes 2 beautiful issues, and each issue comes with an exclusive gift, a surprise just for Notebook subscribers. And shipping is free wherever you are. Issue 3 of the magazine, The Flap of a Butterfly's Wings, is out in select shops right now. It's devoted to the depiction of weather inside and outside of movies, and to the ways in which film culture and industry can be sabotaged, which is so fascinating. This issue features pieces on shooting in extreme weather conditions, filmmaker weather diaries, 16mm film restoration, how to render a movie unstreamable, debating Godard's Contempt, Tsai Ming Liang's list of things a filmmaker should know, and a whole lot more. Subscriptions are now open for issue 4 and issue 5. You can subscribe to the magazine now for $40 a year. Plus, the upcoming issue comes with a bespoke vinyl record featuring an original track by filmmaker Gus Van Sant and an experimental composition by sound artist and designer Leslie Schatz. Find out more at mubi.com/magazine. And as always, you can go to mubi.com/Broe Deschanel to get a whole month of great cinema for free. Special thank you to Louis Osta, Syed Hassan, Mel Pertwee, Morgan, Cooper Stimson, Nadia C., Nick, Jenny Eller, J. Frost McFinnigan, Gabriel M., The Wiz Daniel, Connor O'Keefe, Sharma, Daniel Sardunas, Jenya, Scott Barnett, Julia Campana, Alexis, Nafis Bullock, Carrie Gavin, RSS, Fridtjof Hallstrom, Alex Short, and Kelly Wolf for supporting this channel.